paper that I'm going to give today is a history of the arrival of the formalised study of international affairs in India. The paper is based on a book project which I worked on at my previous job as a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Johannesburg. That project is ongoing. We're looking at the emergence of the study of international affairs around the margins of the British Empire, so Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa and India. This particular paper is coming out in the journal South Asia next month. My co-author on the project, Vineet Thakur, who recently moved to Leiden University in the Netherlands, is of course not here today. He did a great deal of the archival research for this particular paper, but I will carry on as best I can without him. So, conventional narratives of the study of international relations in India begin with the founding of the Indian Council of World Affairs in 1943, under whose auspices the School of International Studies was opened in 1955. This School of International Studies was later moved into Jawaharlal Nehru University and has been central to the teaching and studying of international relations in India ever since. Now, I don't want to dispute that story at all. We just want to add some more detail to it and dig deeper into the colonial origins of IR's arrival into India. This will tell us not just about the study of IR in India, but also tell us something of the political currents in late colonial India, the colonial government's control over ideas of the international in colonial India, and how these affected what was assumed to be a new objective and scientific method for studying international affairs. Now, Nehru's influence was critical in the founding of the ICWA and the School of International Studies, which now lives in a university named after him. And as a result, India's IR thinking is often assumed to have always been wedded to his original anti-colonial nationalism. Nehru's foreign policy was, at least, aimed partly at ending imperial dominance in international politics. This was very much something in the interests of the post-colonial state, and it had a normative basis as well, trying to make colonialism an unacceptable conduct in international affairs. India under Nehru was very successful at this, and many Indian or Nehruvian ideas made it into the original formulation of the post-World War II international order. However, as we'll see here today, the history of IR's arrival in India is rather more complex, and it precedes the story of the ICWA by at least a decade and arguably more. IR's arrival in India was tied to the global history of the study of international affairs, which, as recent scholarship and disciplinary history suggest, was embedded in a broader British imperial project. So, before I go any further, there's a lot of acronyms in this paper, and it's going to be much simpler for everyone watching if I go through them to begin with. So you'll notice here the key set of institutes all have the same name, Institute of International Affairs. So we have the IIIA, the RIIA, the AIIA, and so on. And then we have the Indian Council on World Affairs, ICWA, School of International Studies in JNU. JNU, of course, means Jawaharlal Nehru University. And I'll also occasionally refer to the Royal Institute of International Affairs as Chatham House. Does everyone know what Chatham House is? It's one of the first international relations think tanks in the world, established in 1920, and the other institutes are all affiliated with it. And so they open them in Australia, South Africa, Canada, New Zealand, and then finally India. When I refer to IR, I mean international relations as a discipline. I don't mean it as a practice. I don't mean it as the international affairs happening out in the world. I'm referring to the discipline and the study of it. Okay. So, bearing that in mind, I'm going to start by delving into the background of the study and the goals of this group of British imperialist thinkers who were constructing this set of institutes and setting them up around the world, and then I'll move on to look at what happened when they came to India and what the Indian experience did to their project. So, this paper is not so much a study of Indian international thought, but of institutions for the formalised study of international affairs. Of course, Indian international thought around the world actually predates this story by several centuries, arguably millennia. But this means I'm not going to talk about other forms of international thought today. I'm not going to look at people like Kautilya or Tagore. I'm just going to look at a certain set of thinkers who are involved in this particular institute and what that tells us about the study of international affairs in India, and then what it tells us about colonial India as well. So these other thinkers are really important to study, but that's not the focus for me here today. These institutes didn't have that much appeal for a lot of political groups in India. The people that got involved were primarily Indian liberals and politicians representing the Muslim League, and then politicians representing the Indian National Congress as well. It's quite often asked in IR, why is there no non-Western, Chinese, African or Indian international relations theory? And there's a couple of problems with this question that I think that this paper gets at. First of all, it assumes that all pre-existing IR theory is purely Western with no influence from other places. And there's a kind of Eurocentrism to that question and to that answer. India, in fact, was part of the founding of IR. It's just that we don't acknowledge it properly. Second, as this story will show, Indians were marginalised within the study of international relations and so restricted from theorising within its first official think tanks and institutes. So it's no accident then that most of the dominant theories of IR today can be traced back as being Western or even imperialist. Anti-colonial nationalists in India and elsewhere around Asia, Africa, Latin America did imagine different world orders and theorise about the world. It's more that they were excluded from IR's original institutions. So we can see from this a couple of important issues of the origins of the study of international affairs. Our larger project is focused on the history of international relations at the imperial margins, and we argue that the set of institutes that I showed you before and some of the key ideas of the study of IR emerged not from the UK or the US, but from interactions at the imperial margins, starting actually with South Africa. So this school of imperialist thinkers led by Lionel Curtis, they believed that they had helped to provoke the founding of the South African state. And they thought they did this by forming a think tank and then by starting a journal. And so hashing out ideas and then disseminating them about why there needed to be a state in South Africa. They also thought that South Africa was a microcosm of the British Empire because it was such a multiracial society. And then they thought after that, if they then circulated their ideas around the British Empire, setting up institutes for the study of international affairs and then having a shared journal that disseminated their ideas and papers around the world, they could get the empire to look at the world the same way, and that would naturally mean that the empire could act together, could act simultaneously in world affairs. So, headed by Lionel Curtis, they travelled around Australia, New Zealand, Canada and India, trying to produce support for their transnational network of think tanks and a journal called The Round Table, which is still an international relations journal today. Some of their ideas were also actually written into world politics because they were influential in the founding of the League of Nations and the mandate system. So our larger project argues that these are part of the foundations of the study of international relations as a discipline, particularly in each of these places. Now, IR's original formation then was not just to look at how to better administer politics around the world, it was also partly about how to control world affairs. So why does this matter? The history of the discipline isn't neutral in the way that it thinks. In the case of IR, this means the history of IR is implicated in the way that we think about world affairs today. So we push back against something that we refer to as the Aberystwyth narrative, which is a different story of the origins of international relations. I personally remember being told this at an introduction to IR lecture, which argued that the discipline started in 1919 in the wake of World War I. A group of liberal thinkers felt that World War I was so heinous that it meant we could no longer leave the thinking about international affairs to the politicians. It was too dangerous. Within this narrative, the discipline was defined by an idealistic liberalism. And the narrative goes that this was then challenged by E.H. Carr before World War II. Carr argued that states are self-interested, and that they competed with one another for power, and this is supposedly one of the first great debate in international relations. This story is at least partially accurate insofar as a School of International Studies was founded in 1919 at Aberystwyth, and it was foundational to IR, and they talked an awful lot about peace. But the perpetual peace that they imagined at this point was not so much the liberal democratic peace that we think of today, in which democratic states never fight one another, and therefore when every state is a democracy, war will permanently disappear. It was actually to be the permanent and global establishment of the British Empire. So what's wrong with forgetting this history? If the discipline's birth was just some idealistic attempt to end all conflict, we take race, racism, imperialism and colonial violence off the discipline's agenda. And it assumes that IR is about the study of international anarchy, war and peace, rather than the study of imperialism, race, racism and hierarchy. The school at Aberystwyth was deeply connected to Chatham House and the spread of thinkers who were busy spreading themselves around the world. Their arrival in India, though, is what showed the enormous limitations of their project. So today I'll narrate the story of the institutional founding of IR in late colonial India and try to draw some conclusions as to exactly what that means. Sorry, the computer wants me to update it, but I'm not going to do it. So, here is a very brief summation of their network. The Royal Institute for International Affairs, Chatham House, opened in 1920. These other institutes opened around the British Empire gradually, every couple of years. They were based on the roundtable groups that were set up by Lionel Curtis in the 1910s and 1920s. All of these institutes still exist, and they all produce a journal and fit within the discipline. And they're all modelled on the Chatham House method with a vision of the scientific study for international affairs. So they imagined that they were performing an objective, non-ideological study of international affairs, but actually what they were doing, they had a particular political mission in mind, a particular imperial mission in mind. What was their method? So they're all connected to Chatham House. They all publish in the Roundtable every couple of months with an update on what's going on in their society and how their society looks at international politics. There are particular rules that come with this affiliation. So they're not supposed to voice an official position on international politics. They're not supposed to have political affiliations, but again, by spreading themselves around the world, by sharing their ideas, they thought they would naturally improve imperial governance, and this was ultimately a political act. They were trying to provoke what they referred to as an organic union. But actually, when we read their original research from the 20s and 30s today, we can see that their study of international affairs was immediately placed into the ideological and political context of each geographical location. So I'll give a quick example from the Australian Institute of International Affairs, which I think demonstrates this really well. I'll just quickly by looking at their research priorities. The Institute had 3 locations, one in Victoria, one in New South Wales, one in Queensland, and then a national office in Canberra. The Victorian one was to focus its research on the peopling of Australia and land utilisation. The Queensland one was to focus on the problems of tropical Australia with, quote, special reference to settlement. At the time they saw tropical Australia as foreign territory. New South Wales was to focus on Australia's colonial possessions in New Guinea and Nauru, performing a sort of colonial anthropological analysis. And the Institute as a whole was based in Canberra, was to study East Asian relations. So we can see there that the study that they did was defined by Australian identity and Australian politics at the time, and also that the international issues they were studying were very much based on colonial priorities. They were focused, the key international issue for Australia at the time was how to settle it. And they also did studies of things like the White Australia policy. So the international at this point was very much tethered to the colonial. So they all thought within the political currents of the time, and the international in international affairs was deeply colonial. But what happens when they went to India? We'll see that this method was quite farcical in its implementation. Now, they weren't the first group to open an institute for the study of international affairs in India. By way of a prologue, they actually had a competitor. Lenka Sundaram founded the Indian Institute of International Affairs in 1932 in Vijayawada in South India. Sundaram had won a scholarship from a Gujarati Maharaja to study in the UK. By the time he came back to India, he had intimate knowledge of the Round Table's practices. He'd published heavily in the UK and in continental Europe. He had a PhD from London University, and he'd also published in Chatham House journals with some of the key thinkers in Chatham House. So he was a fairly serious scholar at the time. He went on to be the inaugural INC Member of Parliament for Vishakhapatnam. But it's here that the colonial government crushed his institute. Having established the institute, he asked Chatham House for affiliation and funding along the lines in which the previous institutes had done before. So Chatham House wrote to the colonial government and the Madras Presidency to ask whether or not they should assist him. The Madras Presidency responded to Chatham House that Sundaram, quote, himself is a man of no property and no profession, the son of a cook, and that his real aim was to secure himself a lucrative appointment. He actually had a PhD in international law at the time, so I think that counts as a profession. His goal might have been to get himself a job, and that's not an uncommon goal when you're founding an institute. That's fair enough. They also alleged that he'd been arrested and had worked directly with Mahatma Gandhi as secretary to Gandhi's secretary. We searched, and we couldn't actually find any evidence that that was accurate. We couldn't find any corroborating evidence for that. So they recommended he be refused funding until it was clear that the INC wouldn't control his institute. So it's pretty clear here that the Madras Presidency was very concerned about who could study the international in India. Studying international affairs was not something the Raj wanted its colonial subjects doing. There's barely any future reference to this institute. Sundaram carried on publishing in international affairs on the status of India in particular. He did so on his own and as a professor at Andhra University. So it seems that without much funding, his institute folded fairly quickly. The following year, Chatham House began planning for their own Indian Institute of International Affairs, and just 3 years later, they opened it in Delhi with the same name.
What year was that?
That was 1936. So, the Indian Institute of International Affairs was founded at Viceroy House, New Delhi, 1936. Its founding statement was just that its sole aim was to encourage and facilitate in India the scientific study of international questions. A host of important political figures were involved, primarily Liberal politicians and 3 ICS members, including Gurja Shankar Bajpai, who went on to be a key figure of India's independent diplomacy. And the Indian Liberals at this point were quite important politically as well. So these were a political party who were prepared to work within imperial structures with the goal of improving those structures for Indians and advancing India's cause within the empire. So rather than tearing down the system which the INC advocated, they tried to work within it. Its chairman was Zafrullah Khan, who went on to be the first foreign minister of Pakistan. And Chatham House was also really central to its foundation. So Stephen Kinghall, who was one of Chatham House's key administrators, stated when inaugurating the institute that the head of the IIIA should be an Englishman with experience of working within Chatham House and preferably only a slight previous acquaintance with Indian conditions. This is a classic sort of colonial tactic. They did the same thing when selecting Radcliffe to draw the lines for partition, the idea being that you need fresh eyes to make a quick decision. The Bush administration did the same thing in Iraq, so this tactic is generally catastrophic. They also asserted that the head of the institute should be single, unless his wife was able to or was interested in being effectively his secretary. In this case, it immediately alienated the Indian members of the institute. It was pretty offensive to the Indian Liberals in the room, as well as those affiliated with the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. So, this was immediately a bit of a rebellion at this. S.K. Dutta wrote to Lionel Curtis, who was head of the Round Table in Chatham House, "Has it not occurred to anybody to see that an Indian is found and trained for this work? Appointing an English Secretary-General would never be put forward to a Japanese committee or a Chinese committee." So he's arguing that Indians are not being treated at the equal of other Asian cultural or racial groups. So branches were also opened in Bombay and Calcutta, but they didn't perform any research, and so they very quickly became dysfunctional. The institute was not off to a great start. The first meeting of the institute happened in Shimla, where an address was given by South African Minister for the Interior, Jan Hofmeyr. It was titled "A South African Looks at the Empire." So again, this is probably not the best way to endear the institute to its Indian members. Hofmeyr was actually one of the softer South Africans in the government of South Africa with regards to Indians living in Southern Africa. But again, the institute failed to perform any research. For its first 4 years, it didn't produce anything, so it was more or less dysfunctional. It also struggled for funds. Now, you might remember that these institutes are supposed to be unconnected from the government, but all of this particular institute's funds came from the Raj. This was a clear violation of its charter. H.N. Kundru, who would go on to found the ICWA, stated that there was, quote, nothing really Indian in the institute. And this led to the motivation to start a new one, the much celebrated ICWA, the idea being to have a more Indian think tank. The Indian Council on World Affairs was started in 1943. Its president was Tej Bahadur Sapru, who was the head of the Indian Liberal Party at the time. Its vice presidents were Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, G.D. Birla, and Sri Ram. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, of course, was Nehru's sister, and she went on to represent India at the UN and in London after independence. And the two well-known industrialists, Birla and Sri Ram, provided the funding. So this organisation represents another turn in the study of international affairs in India. But because of these affiliations, it became seen as dominated by the Indian National Congress. And this leads to the Muslim League becoming more involved with the original institute and to seek more control of the Indian Institute for International Affairs. The ICWA started India Quarterly in 1945, which is still a very well-regarded journal. For a variety of reasons, though, it becomes seen as dominated by the INC, and then in the communal climate of India at the time, that means it's seen as Hindu-dominated, and the IIIA gradually becomes seen as Muslim League and British-dominated. And so the clash between the two think tanks, now they both exist, they're fighting for the same publications and same representation at international conferences, and so it takes on a really strong communal turn, the fight between the two. This was referred to by a Chatham House administrator as a fight to the death. They fight over who can produce the most research. They fight over who can represent India at unofficial track 2 diplomacy style conferences. They both start journals. And the conferences they fight over are the IPR conference, that's the Institute for Pacific Relations, and unofficial Commonwealth Relations conferences, which were run by Chatham House. So these are the kinds of things that give this sort of institute a sense of legitimacy. Now, quickly running through both those forms of fight, India can only have one set of representatives at each of these international conferences. The two institutes were fighting over who could represent India. So these types of institutes still do this kind of thing. The Australian Institute for International Affairs and the ICWA still have these sorts of unofficial meetings. They're known as track 2 diplomacy, where rather than having the official governments talk to one another, they have, at a level below, think tanks loosely affiliated with those governments. They talk to one another instead. It's a more low-pressure way to try and hash out international affairs, and sometimes ideas emerge at those meetings and then bubble up. There's Chatham House conferences and Institute for Pacific Relations conferences. There are various attempts made by these institutes, not by the IPR and by Chatham House, to try and fix this problem, to try and get them to share representation, but they never manage to do it because each institute wants to dominate the other. Now, publishing. Strange motivation for publishing. Thankfully, this kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. We would never publish as motivation to be better than another institute. So we can learn quite a bit about the identity of each institute just by looking at the founding provocation for the journals that they started. The Journal of the Indian Institute for International Affairs followed the Chatham House scientific method kind of model, gathering facts for the improvement of world peace. So a new awareness of foreign affairs in India was needed because India had been directly involved in war. India had become more than ever aware of her place in the world and more eager to play her part in the world. The ICWA had a slightly more anti-colonial angle in trying to in explaining why it had started this journal. The fact that India has had no share in shaping her foreign policy is largely responsible for the absence of effective public opinion here on international affairs, but the same fact makes continued vigilance all the more essential. So here the opening provocation is India doesn't have a foreign policy, and it should have one. Now, this event, the 1947 Asian Relations Conference, really sealed the rivalry between the two institutes and leads to the ICWA's victory, at least in the context of India. The conference was Nehru's idea. It brought together a vast number of delegates from around Asia. They discussed various international issues such as race, gender, and hierarchy and anti-colonialism. It's seen today as a precursor to the Bandung Afro-Asia Conference in 1955, which is seen as a landmark in solidifying the non-aligned movement. 193 delegates and 51 observers from 34 countries, but the Muslim League boycotted the conference. And its newspaper, Dawn, argued that the conference reveals to us the expansionist designs of Indian Hinduism. So now I will come to the end of the historical narrative and then I'll wrap up. As I imagine we all know, colonial India was partitioned into India and Pakistan in August of 1947. And as this becomes clear, and as the two institutes now truly hate one another, the Muslim League decided to take control of the IIIA once and for all. So K. Sawar Hassan, with the assistance of Liaquat Ali Khan's secretary, enrolled as many Muslim League members into the institute as possible. He then called a general meeting of the institute, and does so while trying to make sure that as few people affiliated with the INC as possible attend. Within the Institute's constitution, its headquarters could be moved to any city in India. And so at this meeting, they vote to move the Institute's headquarters to Karachi. The books of the Institute were taken to Karachi, even as most of its members remained in India, and this caused some difficulties down the track, and this occurs just a few days before partition. So after partition, with funding from the Pakistan government, Liaquat Ali Khan inaugurated the Pakistan Institute of International Affairs and immediately sought an affiliation with Chatham House. This left both the Indian and Pakistan Institutes for International Affairs in Karachi. The institutes operated out of K. Sawar Hassan's new house in Karachi, and later both operated from the same set of offices in the Frere Hall building. The Indian Institute for International Affairs was shinily shut down in 1948. We're not sure of the precise constitutional means by which this happened, but it's clear enough that the institute was shut down and its material possession absorbed into the Pakistan Institute for International Affairs. So, what can we judge from this story? First, that the context of IR's emergence in India was imperialism, not just anti-imperialism. The story of the Indian Council on World Affairs as emerging near independence out of the ideas of Nehru and Kunzru is not quite accurate. It was sparked also in direct opposition to another Indian institute, one with colonial affiliates. This also tells us something about late colonial India, about the control of ideas and discourse by the colonial government. The colonial government limited funding in an attempt to control discourse over the international, and this stifled the emergence of international relations in India. The first Indian Institute was dominated by the British government and depended on it for funding. This made it very difficult for what we might think of as Indian ideas to enter into what we now think of as international relations theory. Nehru had to found a separate organisation in order for his anti-colonial thought to enter the emerging formal structures of the study of international relations. Finally, the scientific study of IR was rapidly subsumed into the political discourses of each location. The objective methodology proposed by the Round Table for the study of international affairs was shown to be absurd through its arrival in India. Instead, the method was subsumed into the political context in which it was placed. And in late colonial India, this meant tearing apart the institute itself. Thank you.